Right. Hello and good evening, everybody. My name's Neil Redfern. I'm the Executive Director of the Council of British Archaeology, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Festival of Archaeology event, Reimagining National Amenity for the 21st Century. Tonight's panel discussion will be hopefully really informative for you. Before we start, I'd just like to flag the CBA's Code of Conduct. We've put that in the chat for you. So we'd like everyone to abide by our Code of Conduct. There will be opportunities for you to put questions to our panel through the Q&A function on the webinar. Please do that. Please put any other information you want to in the chat, but all questions in the Q&A. If by chance someone puts a question in the chat, we can actually copy that over to the Q&A. At the end of the webinar, we will give you a chance to say goodbye and post anything else you want. And what I'd like to do now is introduce my fellow organizer, Liz Power from Historic Buildings and Places. The CBA is 80 this year, but I'm glad to say we're completely surpassed by Historic Buildings and Places, who are 100 this year, hence why Liz has helped me organise it. Liz, welcome, and do you want to introduce the actual event?
Hello, everybody. Thank you to CBA for hosting us as part of your festival this year. We are celebrating our 100th anniversary, so we are just as old as we feel today, and we are having an absolutely fantastic year, doing all sorts of things to celebrate. But then me and Neil sat together at a conference, which is always a really bad idea, and we had this idea that wouldn't it be nice to get us all publicly in a room together, because you may or may not know that we as National Amenity Societies work together really closely. We work in something called the Joint Committee. We have meetings together. Our caseworkers talk to each other all the time. But it's not very often you get us all in the same space at the same time. So we thought, as a special birthday treat for us and for the CBA, that we would try and get us all together and maybe ask some of those questions that you'd like to know about us as societies, what we do, how we operate, what's our opinion on some of those slightly more controversial things. So that is why we pulled everyone in, and an enormous thank you to all my fellow societies for making time out, especially right at the busy end of the summer period, when we're all trying to get things organised and sprint off on holiday. Some of us might already be on holiday and try and work out who's coming live from a hotel room tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. All the way through, please do post those questions. It doesn't matter if you think we're not going to answer it. You never know. Well, you never know. Try and go for some ones that might surprise us. But like all good question times, we need somebody to keep us all in order. And I'm absolutely delighted that Claudia Kenyatta is with us this evening to do that job. Best of luck to you, Claudia. Hopefully lots of you already know Claudia. She works for Historic England, where she is the Director of Regions, a job share role. And the work that happens out in the regions, absolutely amazing. And I cannot imagine the job you have, Claudia, trying to pull people around the country together and kind of coordinating and making sure we've got best practice across the country. So Claudia, in spite of your busy job, thank you for making time to be with us this evening. And I will hand the evening over to you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Liz, and good evening, everybody. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you very much to the CBA and to Liz and Neil for the opportunity to be part of this panel discussion. I'm really looking forward to what I know is going to be a really interesting discussion at what feels like a really key point for heritage and for the sector. But before we get started and turn to our questions, I'd like to turn to our power panel here. And I'd like to ask each of them in 3 minutes if they could just introduce themselves, introduce their organisation, and share with us one key issue facing heritage at this point. So perhaps I could start with Catherine. And Catherine Croft, a hand over to you.
Somebody chose to mute me while I was Yes, thank you very much. I'm Catherine Croft. I'm Director of 20th Century Society. We're the youngest of the National Amenity Societies. We were founded in 1979. Initially, we were known as the 30th Society, and we dealt with interwar buildings. But I think we've always been absolutely adamant that we care about buildings regardless of style. And so we started out looking at Art Deco and Neo-Georgian and Tudor-Beaton buildings, but we've definitely moved on to cover the post-war period, and we spend an awful lot of time dealing with brutalist buildings and high-tech buildings, and most recently we've been looking at postmodern buildings as well. So we definitely feel that casework is absolutely central to what we're about, and we spend a lot of time, probably more than most of the other societies, nominating buildings and making the case for them to be added to the statutory lists, because the buildings that we care about haven't been systematically surveyed before. So I mean, I think that the issue that I'm most involved with really is just moving the discussion on and making the case for the value of the most recent architecture, the architecture of the last 30 years, and sometimes less than 30 years. We're putting buildings forward for listing. We're actually about to deal with our first 21st century case. So I think it's, for us, it's working not just with the public to try and change those perceptions, but also trying to support conservation officers in local authorities to evaluate the buildings of the more recent past. And we support our casework through a huge range of publications which are designed to do exactly that. We also have a very extensive events programme, which I would love to welcome all the viewers to consider joining us and coming on some of our trips. We do a lot of events in the UK, but we also go abroad. So we're about to go off to Venice and the Veneto. We're going to Split later in the summer, if anyone hasn't booked their summer holiday and fancies a trip. And next year we'll be going to both Chicago and Cologne. So I think we try and combine doing really effective casework with getting people to really enjoy buildings and enjoy learning about them in the company of other enthusiasts.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Catherine. And I'll next go to Matthew. So Matthew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Claudia, and good evening, everyone. I'm Matthew Slocum, of the SBAB, appointed director about 12 years ago now. Before that, I was the organisation's head of casework, which is useful in giving insights into the listed building system. I've also been secretary of this thing, the Joint Committee of the National Amenity Societies, for about 15 years now, which is a wonderful opportunity to see the work of all the organisations involved. First, though, I'd like to offer huge congratulations to the CBA and HB&P on their anniversaries. These are major achievements, and to survive and really thrive for such a long period is really a great thing. The SBAB, though, as many will know, is now approaching the grand old age of 150, and we're currently considering how we're going to mark that important anniversary. I think it needs to be both celebration and forward-looking at the same time. You know, we don't want to gaze at our navels. We want it to mean something for the future as well as the past. So, as poor Joe Biden discovered this weekend, has to be said that great age, though, is not always seen as a good thing. Despite all that accumulated wisdom of time, agedness can sometimes be viewed as obsolescence. I'd completely disagree with this, of course, but the solution, I think, for any organisation like ours is continual evolution, adaptation and reinvention to adapt to times. The SBAB, I'm pleased to say, is usually viewed as a sort of reassuring constant within the historic buildings world. But it annoys me deeply when it's rather assumed that the organisation is just the same as it was in William Morris's day back in the 19th century. It's certainly true that the organisation I joined 30 years or so ago was utterly different to the one it is today. It then had maybe half a dozen staff. We're now up to about 35 full-timers and part-timers. We were then dealing with a much narrower range of activities than we do now. So really, standing still is never an option for any of us. And I think we've got to recalibrate, and certainly at a point in time where we've got a new government, there'll be different priorities set. We've all got to adjust a little bit to those changing situations. But in other ways, continuity is strength. The SBAB has its core values, which have remained the same throughout its lifetime. And we've kept them because we consider them enduring. We think they're as relevant now as they were today. But you can still hang on to those values and adjust the way they're applied depending on the circumstances of the time. The SBAB has shifted an awful lot. It began in the 19th century as a militant campaigner. It then became a crucial advisor to government in the middle of the 20th century. And then it's changed again more recently to become a consultee with a slightly more arm's length relationship with government and with local authorities. Our specialisms have evolved over time too. So we like to think of ourselves as expert in craft and professional training. We have technical expertise too in building performance and repair methods, those kind of things. We're also very interested in the industrial heritage of traditional wind and water mills. And our casework concentrates, unlike Catherine's, on buildings at the other end of the spectrum. So ours are 1720 or before. We are a little different to some of the other National Amenity Societies in that we cover both the whole of the UK and now have a branch in the Republic of Ireland. So we're spreading our wings as far as we can. In recent years, our particular emphasis has been on site-based activities. It's a bit of a USP for the SBAB, particularly around the working parties, which we hold on site. There are chances for people to get their hands dirty, to do really practical things and learn through that exercise. And the great thing about that for us is it draws in a younger audience. It's a great way to bring new people into the field and allow them to do those things that give them a taster of historic buildings work. Finally, another strand to our work in recent years has been our Old House project. This is about not just campaigning for buildings at risk, but actually finding a building and fixing it. So the building we acquired in 2018 is a grade 2-star building at risk, empty for 50 years. It's about rescuing it, of course, but that's only part of the story. So we've extracted maximum value through training, through community engagement, through grappling with those challenges of sustainability for old buildings, and also even producing our own conservation materials on site. And one of the side benefits for me of this project is viewing things as an applicant. It gives a completely different perspective on things to being a consultee. It's been rather illuminating and also slightly troubling at times as well. So I think the key issue, if I can finish here, is how we collectively can achieve sustainable reuse for a range of historic buildings, not just buildings at risk, churches, banks, high street buildings, when so much is changing in society, in the economy, and particularly with climate demands on those buildings.
Thank you, Matthew. This is where I do my gentle reminder that the one job Neil has given me is to keep to time, so that we make sure we've got the opportunity to pick up some of the questions in the chat, which are already coming in. Some really interesting questions there that will pick up on quite a lot of what you've just said, Matthew, and some of the things that Catherine has raised as well. But I think that the key thing that we'll come back to is your point that standing still is never an option. Thank you. So if we could go next to Deborah. Deborah, over to you.
Hello, good evening. I'm Deborah Evans. I'm here this evening to represent the Gardens Trust, of which I'm a trustee and currently chair of the Conservation Committee, and relatively recent in those posts, so I'm a bit of a newbie. The Gardens Trust itself, it was formed in 2015 with amalgamation with the Association of Gardens Trusts, who are now known as the County Gardens Trust. But our origins are earlier. We are based in the Garden History Society that was actually founded in 1966. And the organization has always been passionate about the research and the protection and the conservation of designed landscapes, particularly in England. And the work of the Garden History Society really inspired and probably pushed the creation of the Register of Historic Parks and Gardens, which were created through the Heritage Act in 1983. The other countries, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, have subsequently formed their own registers of such landscapes. There are currently about 1,700 of them on there. The critical thing for the Gardens Trust is that while we are always very pleased to be aligned to the National Amenity Societies, in 1995, we were actually granted statutory consultee status, which actually makes us slightly different. So there is a duty for us to be consulted, and we have a responsibility to respond to consultations that come forward from local planning authorities. And we do that with a combination of our own very small paid staff, conservation team, but we work collaboratively with our fellows in the County Gardens Trusts, who really supply so much of the research and the, if you like, the real understanding of significance, which helps us inform those, the advice that we then offer to the local planning authorities. We are a membership organisation. We also have a very lively and well-received events programme, which also does include occasionally travel abroad. So again, it's an international perspective, not just a national or even local perspective. And we have benefited from a lot of support and specialist training over the years, particularly delivered by Historic England and others, which has enabled the Gardens Trust to help support and upskill the County Gardens Trusts in terms of research, in terms of responding to planning applications, and also to benefit the lists, refreshing the list, and really just to promote and celebrate parks and gardens at a local level. And there have been specific and very successful initiatives recently, such as Unforgettable Gardens or Suffolk Garden History. And at the moment, we are exploring another grant with Historic England to actually help upskill the trusts in the County Gardens Trust in East of England to help respond to the big NSIP applications which are coming through. So again, very engaged, very looking at landscape from a national to a local level, and really finding ways of local people being able to participate in that while also giving a national perspective and national advice. So in terms of key issues for me, I think one of the things that would be common to all of us, particularly where we're working with volunteers, is the constraints on the volunteer base and the need to be finding new blood, new perspectives, and be open to that, because our traditional audiences are perhaps becoming smaller, and all the other issues that are pressurizing volunteering, the ability to volunteer at the moment. And I think also with landscape, I mean, say we are the statutory consultee on landscape. We advise on all grades of the registered parks and gardens, but it's also looking at landscape almost outside its historic context and looking at ways in which landscape can actually be the glue to help all of our different disciplines, all of our different expert interests come together in a more sustainable and dynamic way to make our wider environment better for all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deborah. And again, I'm sure we'll come back to this point about the volunteer. Where will the volunteers of the future be coming from, and what does that mean for the way that amenity societies need to operate and promote their work? So thank you. Maybe next we could go to David. David, over to you.
Thank you, Claudia. Well, happy birthday to both CBA and HBP. First of all, I'll try to be very quick, not least because I've got a bit of a croaky throat. I'm director of the Georgian Group, which was founded in 1937 in response to the demolition of really very major buildings, principally in London, for which at the time there was no statutory protection whatsoever. And it started off as a subset of the SPAB, operating as a committee under its aegis before the two-party company sometime later. Our statutory remit is from 1700 to 1837, but actually we take an interest, a scholarly interest at least, in buildings from the Restoration 1660, and indeed also take an interest in the continuing classical tradition of buildings up to the present day. In the question of early railway architecture, we defer to the Victorian Society, although there's a little bit of overlap there. Casework, like the others, is very important to us, and we have 4 full-time caseworkers and 1 part-time caseworker, and we reckon that we look at about 58% of the notifications that come through to the joint committee. We have 2,500 members, and like the other societies, we organise visits and lectures and produce a magazine, and we think importantly an annual scholarly journal, and it's really through that research in the journal that we feel we have an authoritative basis to comment. 2 things, if I may, that are on our mind at the moment, and which I'm sure we will all join forces on and discuss with the new government, are housing, which is a big subject. It may not seem to you that that's necessarily something for the amenity societies to consider, but of course new housing will impact on landscape, as Deborah said, and also on townscape, and we want to try to encourage the government to think about how that can be done as well as possible, and that the necessary infrastructure is put in place, something that hasn't been happening with I'm afraid the volume builders who aren't interested in that kind of investment. And the second issue is relief on VAT for repairs, which has been a long-running issue for the heritage sector. Arguments have been going on for about 20 years, but we believe that there's a new argument to be made. We have to persuade Treasury that there is actually a financial benefit for getting rid of VAT on repairs, and we believe that that is possible to do if one puts a value on the embedded carbon in buildings. It seems ridiculous that buildings are thrown away essentially because it's cheaper to rebuild than to invest in existing structure. And part of the problem of that is the VAT issue. I think that's all from me, Claudia.
That's great. Thank you, David. So let's turn, Liz, everybody has already said happy birthday, and thank you for your previous introduction, but I'll come to you now, just particularly on that point of what is the one thing that is very much on your mind at the moment?
Yeah, thanks for the birthday wishes. No birthday cake, though, I'm noticing, which is a letdown. So we're the smallest amenity society. We don't separate by age. We look at all historical buildings and all historical places, but we are particularly interested in industrial buildings, working class history, just those really normal buildings that may get overlooked as everyone looks at the really posh, fancy looking ones, but they are vitally important to communities and to people around the UK. So big heritage issue. I think for me, it just has to be the climate emergency. It is the thing that is going to impact absolutely everything we do. And it's not just impact in infrastructure, what impact that's going to have on landscape or potential risk to historic buildings. I am more excited about the potential for heritage to be really transformative, and really help people on the path to net zero, live in amazing communities that are sustainable and ready for the climate emergency, adapted, suitable. Some of the most traditional buildings are the ones that are going to be able to weather the storm, literally. So I think that's the biggest challenge for heritage, but I think it's probably also our biggest opportunity that we've had in a long time to really shout about how relevant, interesting and exciting heritage can be. But there's loads of challenges for us to face to make that message heard.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Liz. And finally, Neil, I'll turn to you, please. So what's the one thing very much on the CVA's mind at the moment?
So ours is about how do we address issues around belonging in heritage and archaeology. And to understand belonging, you need to understand the barriers to people participating and how we broaden who actually participates in heritage and the stories and the conversations we want to have about that. And in some ways it mirrors what Liz has said about actually what does heritage and archaeology mean to younger contemporary members of society? What are the issues they're going to face, and how are we going to actually help them come in and shape our conversation? So again, belonging means about how do we draw younger voices into this conversation? How do we empower those voices? How do we understand the real emphasis of legitimizing their concerns in these conversations and what that actually means?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Neil. And thank you to the whole of the panel for a really interesting introduction and for picking up some of those key issues I'm sure we're going to come back to in the discussion. But let's go to questions now. And thank you so much to everybody who's been posting questions in the Q&A. Some really good and thought-provoking questions in there. And I'd like to kick off, if I may, with a question from Clemency, who's asked, what are your hopes and fears for heritage in the planning system with a new government in power? And how are you lobbying the government about your priorities? Are you doing so collectively? So a big question, and one that I think looks back to what you started to talk about, David, when you talked about the challenge around housing, and also, Deborah, some of the work that you mentioned with Historic England, looking at engagement with the NSIP process in the east of England. So I'll take this as an open question. It's a big question, but perhaps to kick us off, I might invite you, Deborah, just to say a little bit about the emerging planning reform agenda from the new government and how best the amenity societies can engage with that debate.
Thank you, Claudia. I think a collective response, I think standing together is absolutely essential. Partly that so that we can be seen more as collaborative rather than just objecting. I think the days of just drawing the line in the sand, I mean, occasionally there will be cases or proposals where you think, no, this cannot happen. But I think generally we've got to be seen to be broadly supportive and positive in our engagement with government going forward. I mean, in terms of what's the signals that are coming down the line, I mean, I think there are possibly quite that. I'm just thinking of Ed Miliband's decisions regarding at least one large solar farm in Cambridge area very recently, which I think in terms of the landscape community, I think we had hoped that would not happen there. It is now going to happen there. And there are two other very big solar proposals on the table at the moment, which the Gardens Trust and others are engaged in at Botley West in Oxfordshire and also Lime Down in Wiltshire. And those two proposals are actually being promoted by two of the big, great estates, Blenheim and Babington, and partly its response to the lack of clarity on agricultural policy in this country. So again, it's how all of these things are fitting together. So we've got to be positive. We've got to accept there is going to be development. But I think through our collective expertise, provide those nuances and additional insights to governments to really try and get the best development in the most appropriate place where it delivers, but at the same time it does the least harm.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Deborah. So moving from the perception of amenity societies as blockers to the perception of amenity societies as trusted partners who can help deliver deliver better outcomes for government. David, would you like to pick up on some of what Deborah has said, or just loop back to the point you made in your introduction about housing? You talked a little bit about the impact on landscapes and townscapes, and you also picked up on VAT. But we've also had a specific question from Leslie about what changes might be needed to the planning system specifically with that objective of greater housing delivery. Is there anything else you want to say?
The so-called housing emergency is real, and it's important that society addresses it. Whenever there's a great rush to do something, there's also a danger that, you know, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater. And we saw that, I think, in the draft white paper, the planning paper, which actually collectively we did object to, and various alterations were made. I think we all thought that the levelling up and regeneration bill that finally came through was much better, because it took better account of all those checks and balances. So it is a very complicated thing, but it would be awful if, in the rush to solve this problem, were we to build a generation of housing that will not be fit for purpose, and that will have to be pulled down in 20 or 30 years, either because it's not very well made or it isn't supported by the right infrastructure. And ideally, we ought to be building in a way that your successors at Historic England in 50 years plus time would be interested in protecting and listing. So it's a fine balancing act, I think, but we have collectively lobbied government in the past. I think it's a bit premature to be doing that with the new government while they're trying to settle in. But we certainly will be doing that. And as Deborah says, I think across the board, we have quite a lot of expertise to try to bring to bear and comment on emerging policy and legislation.
Thank you, David. I don't want to move on from the key issue of planning reform without making sure that there aren't other amenity societies who wanted to come in. And Liz, I think, did you have your hand up? Let me go to you next.
I was just going to say that I think we're in a really good position to line up with some of the new government's thoughts, particularly around communities and local engagement, and maybe kind of giving more power to the regions. By nature of the work we do, we're engaging with local authorities and people who work in those communities and helping and advising them. So I think we've got a really good opportunity there to kind of to be able to say to government, you know, we've got a big picture, but actually we've also got some really local relationships that we can help and support as these plans go forward, because we do want to be on the side of growth as a country. We desperately all need that. And yes, we want to be on the side of people and houses and reusing buildings. So I think making sure we are telling that positive story. And as for the collective lobbying, I went to so many meetings last week about the new government where everyone kind of went, oh, there's a new government, we don't know what to do yet. And I thought by the third one, I kind of get it. We just need to give them a bit of time. And then definitely the heritage sector as a whole and the amenities together will be looking to ways to help and work with them and help them learn about our sector. And that's one of the joys of a new government coming in, is that we get to tell them all about it.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz. Now everybody wants to come in. So let's go to Neil, and then after that to Matthew. So Neil, over to you.
Brilliant. Sorry, mine's going to be a terribly niche argument because I'm going to focus on archaeology. So I think there's a real opportunity in the discussions that might come forward around planning policy for us to ask for a tiny little tweak which might redefine what we consider to be public benefit from planning and archaeological interventions. At the moment, it's very narrowly focused on doing archaeological mitigation, excavation, and then a report, where I think we can do far more around engaging the communities where that work is actually happening. We can do far more about understanding how that role feeds into placemaking, how it feeds into everything Liz was actually saying about what is locally distinctive about places, but actually how it can start to create really engaging conversations with people about the meaning of their place. And so for me, I think we're massively underselling ourselves because we've in many ways gone down the preservation, got to keep everything route. And actually, if we really understood what is the opportunity to shape the places that we might want to develop, then there's a real opportunity. We're not going to do it everywhere, but I think when you start to look at us collectively as a group, we have lots of skills in different places. And again, what we're getting very adept at doing is playing to our strengths. And I think that's going to have, you know, collectively, we cover an awful lot of ground. Individually, we can be really focused when we have to be.
Fantastic. Thanks, Neil. And Matthew, the last word for now on planning reform is with you. So over to you.
Thank you. Very briefly then, Claudia. I think there's quite a lot to be worried about. You know, if you go back to the Labour manifesto, it was treating planning as a blocker, and we could be easily portrayed as that. So there's a conversation to be had, and as Deborah's rightly said, you know, persuading government that we are here to advise and assist is the first step. I would say for me, also talking not just about new houses, but about sensitive reuse of so many structures that are potentially capable of providing housing and are being overlooked at the moment. You know, there's a real job for us to do there. And also talking about sensible, sustainable energy efficiency upgrades. A vast amount of public money could be thrown at the wrong solutions that will backfire in years to come. So if we can really inform that discussion and assist where that public money goes, if grants are offered, then I think that will be a really valuable job for us to do.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew. I'm going to move on now to a question which has come up in the chat in a sort of variety of different ways. So I'll just sort of try and draw it together into a question from Duncan, which is, the National Amenity Societies have a different status in each of the home countries. Should they be campaigning for greater consistency of treatment? For example, to be statutory consultees on heritage-related planning applications in all 4 countries. A slightly different question focused on the role of the amenity societies, and perhaps I could turn to you, Catherine, for a response.
Yeah, well, 20th Century Societies only recently been added to the list of statutory consultees for Wales. That happened back in 2022 and came on the back of us launching a really successful C10 to 20 Cymru group that's been working very closely with my casework team. It was interesting when we did that, we tweeted about it. We had one of the Paul Sweeney, who's a member of the Scottish Parliament, immediately leaping on social media and saying, "Oh, why is it not like that in Scotland?" And which I think kind of did make us kind of think about that. I mean, things do work differently. The Scottish planning legislation is different, and there are a lot of organisations up there, including the Architectural History Society of Scotland, who are doing a similar role to us. But I think that that there is scope for us working in a much more collaborative way, and being more engaged. There are also all sorts of strange things, like the way that in England, you can only put a building forward, you can only spot list a building if there is an immediate threat to it under the planning system, whereas in Scotland, if there's already a planning application or even a sniff of a planning application around a specific site, then spot listing isn't an issue, isn't contemplated. So that there are very different ways of working. And I mean, I think it would be really good to compare those, what's going on in the different countries, and think about how we can get best practice from all the different areas, all the different countries, kind of to make an ideal solution for for joint working.
Fantastic. Thanks, Catherine. And I wonder, just to follow on from that, whether, Matthew, there's anything you might like to add?
Catherine's right that there are some real sort of cultural and legislative differences between the countries. Eye-opening for me has been in the Republic of Ireland, where our branch actually has to pay a fee to submit a comment on a historic building application. You know, a really bizarre concept for anyone based in England, but true. Overall, though, I'd say I probably have mixed views. You know, it does seem odd to me that we're operating in different countries and only have a formal status in 2 of them. But there is some advantage in being a little bit detached from the statutory system. You know, once you're in that, there are obligations on you to look at everything, to you know, cover everything with a great breadth. Whereas I think organizations like SAVE have shown that if you can really focus on key threats, individual buildings, and give them all your resources, you know, you can actually have more of an impact. So I'd say, you know, pros and cons, possibly best to stick with what we've got in the countries where we don't have statutory status, but only if we're using that opportunity to really fight for those cases where we can make a difference.
Thank you, Matthew. Really good to hear. Mixed views about whether the best of all worlds is possible or not, but some interesting reflections there on the kind of status of amenity societies and when is it useful to be to have a statutory role, and perhaps where do you have advantages by not. I'm going to move on to something a little bit different now, and I wanted to pick up something that Neil, I think, began to talk about in his introduction, and which has sparked quite a lot of discussion and some questions in the Q&A. So I think it's a question about engaging communities in the work of amenity societies and in the advice that they give. And I think I'd like to sort of broaden that out a little bit into a question about engaging new groups and new audiences and looking to the future. So not just about advice, but also about building that volunteer cohort for the future, building membership for the future, and ensuring a sustainable future for amenity societies. So there's a lot in there, but perhaps, Neil, I could go to you first for your thoughts.
Thank you, Claudia. I think this is a really important point, and in many ways, it's the area we've got the most learning to do. We are very good at doing community engagement when we get people who are like us coming to talk to us. So we're very good at talking to ourselves, I would say. We're exceptional at that. And we've got to get out of that bubble, okay? But to get out of that bubble really effectively, we've got to realize we are not the community facilitators in 90% of this country's communities. So we need to go and find out who those people are, yeah? And we've got an amazing product when you actually think about it. We have this thing that you can ask endless questions about. And so actually finding people who can help facilitate those great conversations. And an awful lot of the time, they're people in economic regeneration teams in local authorities who are looking to engage communities differently. They're people in social welfare teams who are looking to tackle other things. And other issues. And actually when and this is very true with archaeology, when you successfully go to them on their terms, you can suddenly start to find the power of heritage and of archaeology and exploring the questions people have about places. But also I think what we've got to realize in that is you can't just go into a community and expect to have engagement within a couple of weeks and then go away again. So again, we need to be thinking about how we work with those facilitators who can sustain that engagement. So just for archaeology, one of its great challenges in commercial practice is archaeological excavations are now effectively parachuted into communities. So how do you build that long-term engagement? Well, that could be a role for the CBA. We are a network organization that has over 250 archaeological groups and societies that are part of our membership that are based all over the UK. So we can actually start to make some of those connections and actually facilitate that conversation. And again, it's just looking at what our purpose is slightly differently, less necessarily about conservation and preservation, more about what that community in regeneration, community energization really of those places actually is. And I think Matthew's point earlier was really, really important. Actually, this is where less is more. We can't do it everywhere. It's better to do it really brilliantly in one or two places, and then show people how that model actually works. Sorry, you're on.
Sorry, testing my Zoom skills to the full here. Thanks, Neil. I'll go to Liz and then over to Deborah. Liz, over to you.
Thank you. So this is an area that we are, as a society, are only just starting to get our head around what it's going to look like for us in the future. But I feel I'm cheating because before I worked for HB&P, I did 25 years in community engagement in museums. So my background is all about how you engage people in some of the most challenging, difficult conversations in buildings they don't want to go in. So I feel like we've got some really good ideas. And for us as a society, it's starting to think, where can we have the most impact? So really, I don't think any of us want to be writing emails and letters objecting to things. We'd much rather people had really good ideas that we could support. And if we can start thinking and engaging with people so much earlier down that stream, then we wouldn't be the people building the dam at the end. We'd be all the way upstream, helping people with their good ideas. And I saw somebody just popped in the chat. It starts with primary school children. Hooray, I completely agree. Actually working with children, with families, and building it up is where we're going to go. And for us as a society, we're thinking about partnership all the way. I really firmly believe there is no need for any new anythings in this country. There's a billion things going on, and actually looking for great partners who want to work with us to think about how we're going to engage communities in the future. People love the stuff around them. They really do. They don't realize it's special. They don't realize it's listed. They don't realize it's part of a bigger, telling a bigger story of the country. They just love it because it's the thing in their town. And if we can engage those people, then I think we're winning that battle.
Brilliant. Thanks, Liz. Importance of upstream engagement, early engagements. Let's go to Deborah and then to Matthew. So Deborah, over to you.
Thank you. I think with the Gardens Trust, I think we've probably got a lot of experience that we can actually share across the society, because I think gardens are so accessible, and we've shown that for years and years and years with all sorts of outreach, incredibly successful outreach, which has really introduced new audiences to gardens, and not necessarily just through the history. It's often bringing people in through aligned interests, through ecology, through food, through just being in places that they feel safe, that they feel beautiful and restorative. So I think the way in which through our charity and through the County Gardens Trust and through associated bodies such as even with the National Trust, it is landscape and gardens offer so many ways in, and it's a really important experience, and if you like, a structure that we can all benefit and build upon. So please ask and we will share.
Thanks, Deborah. An offer out there. Thank you. We'll go to Matthew and after that to Catherine. Matthew.
Yeah, if you think about most building sites and projects, you know, it's all about hoardings and keeping people out and security and all those obstructions. So we tried something a little bit different with our Old House project, which was just letting people in. And the amazing thing is all the vandalism that was there before has gone away, and better still, people have just continually walked in off the street and asked questions, and some of those have remained with the project throughout and even got involved with it almost on a daily basis. So the more welcoming we can be, I think the better it is for everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew. And Catherine, over to you.
Yes, I was just going to conclude by saying, you know, a lot of the buildings and the sites that we're involved with are people's homes. They're public housing estates, public schools, hospitals. And I think that those do have incredibly rich stories. But I think that as organisations, you know, we do have to do this in partnership, and we really do have to recognise that we're actually quite small and our resources are very stretched. I think it's very easy when you start to kind of talk with local groups to over-raise public expectation about how much time and effort you are going to be able to put in. And for us, it's been much more, I think, about thinking how we can, you know, strategically help people to navigate the planning process. And then beyond that, working through our publications to, you know, to boost people's understanding of the buildings and engage them in that way. You know, I would love to be out there on the ground far more than we are, but I think we have to be careful about being realistic, frankly. Sorry if that's a downer.
No, Catherine, thank you so much. And it sort of leads into the next question I was going to ask. So perhaps we could stick with that theme for now, because it was a question about capacity and resources, which has already come up a few times in the discussion so far this evening. So I think it's a question from Sarah, which is, what additional support do the National Amenity Societies need in order to work more effectively and create greater positive impact for the historic built environment? And I think in asking it, I would broaden it out a little bit beyond additional support, but do answer that. But I also think there's a really interesting discussion that started here about ways of working as well as additional support. So perhaps I could ask David, perhaps you'd like to come in on this one, and then anybody else who'd like to follow.
Well, I suppose in terms of scale, the first ideal, if that's what we're describing, is that we would have good, well-trained, motivated, committed planning officers, conservation officers in all local authorities. And I'm afraid over the years, their number has diminished, although we're past the lowest part of the trough. But I think a lot of young conservation officers coming in, very excited in their new jobs, haven't received the training that they might duly expect, and that's partly because of COVID and all those sorts of things, inability to get to site. So in a way, the amenity societies, in their case, wouldn't need to do casework. Ultimately, we could make ourselves redundant if all local authorities had highly trained staff at that level. And obviously, it's very difficult for local authorities because they have to make decisions, and they have to make decisions between housing and schools and all those sorts of things. It's the same as central government. But we constantly find some local authorities don't have conservation officers at all, and some are desperate for advice. I mean, there is this perception, and it appears in the chat a bit, that relations between the amenity societies and the local conservation offices are poor or hostile. That's not been our experience at all. And we find that people welcome our advice, partly because it just doesn't exist in some local authorities. So I would start there rather than simply putting up our hands and saying we need more funding ourselves. Anyway, enough.
Thanks, David. No, thank you. And I think, Neil, would you like to pick up on some of what David has said?
Yes, I mean, my simple thing there is how do we perceive ourselves and the work that the casework teams in historic England how do we act as a national collection of knowledge around how we value the historic environment, because we can't all do everything. And so again, it's that point. We don't necessarily, whilst we'd all like more money, you don't need it if we can actually dovetail better, and we're more clear, more, we have more clarity. This is, the amenity societies are focusing on grade 2 because that's the capacity they can actually do, but it allows historic England to potentially focus somewhere else. And I think if we're more explicit and actually say that, then there is greater openness and opaqueness. So what's really interesting is that the Joint Committee, our database is totally publicly searchable. We know that other groups and societies use it to understand what's going on in their area, so that they can actually also build responses, and they can actually look at local cases and indeed see our responses. So it's how do we create that sort of network of advice and be really clear about what and why we're each doing it. To do that really effectively, though, the thing we actually need is a little bit of certainty in that managing that process. Yeah. And we're very good at making a little bit go a long way and drawing in other things. It's that really thing. By being focused, yeah, we actually can deliver better outputs.
Great, thanks, Neil. So we've had capacity in the sector, and particularly in local authorities. We've had prioritisation come up, and we've had collaboration. Catherine, your hand is up. I don't know if that's a legacy hand or if you wanted to come in on this one. If not, I'll go to Matthew.
I just wanted to briefly add to what Neil was saying, and I noticed there was a comment from Bob Kindred from the Institute of Historic Building Conservation in the Q&A about how we could be more joined up working with local authority conservation officers. And just to say that for my caseworkers to actually have a list of IHBC members who are conservation officers, local authority by local authority, would be enormously helpful, so that we could actually know that we were communicating, we're getting to the right part of the local authority when we're doing our comments.
Brilliant, thanks, Catherine, and a very practical
yeah.
recommendation to end up with. Matthew, I'll go over to you and then on to Deborah. Matthew.
I'd just add that I think we perhaps need to sort of review and reconsider our relationship with expert volunteers, so that going back several decades, you know, when I was first involved, volunteers were really at the heart of things. And although they continue to be, you know, all the societies have increasingly professionalized, because it's very often extremely hard for younger volunteers to find the time with busier working lives to do the things we ask of them. So somehow reinventing that and reconnecting with our expert volunteer network seems a really timely thing for us to be thinking about.
Great, thanks, Matthew. And Deborah, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Matthew. I'd just like to follow that and endorse it, actually, because I think one of the real challenges for the Gardens Trust at the moment is not only sustaining, but being able to support our volunteers, particularly in the County Gardens Trusts. And I think one of the challenges with working with a volunteer body is that often there's this idea that you go in, you deliver training, you leave. And of course you don't. You have to, you know, people need regular support going forward. And I think that's something that we all know, but I think it's something that we really need to, it needs to be much more part of the discussion, particularly in terms of funding, etc. Because as an organisation, the Gardens Trust is very much reliant on the volunteers, particularly to do, if you like, the baseline work, to do the additional research, to do the additional checking of the database, etc. And for that then to be able to inform good, accurate responses, and also to contribute to the conversation more widely. And going back to conservation officers in local authorities, there are also almost no landscape architects now employed at local authority level. And again, it's taking that step back to the actual training of within these, but that is being offered within these professions more broadly, because people don't necessarily see the gaps in their own skill sets. And I think particularly when dealing with design landscapes, there are other considerations that need to come in beyond the pure historic significance. And I think that's where we have the more interesting conversations with the conservation staff at local authority level, and are then able to support them.
Great, thanks very much, Deborah. Some really interesting reflections there on what it takes to work with volunteers in a sustainable and effective way. Thank you. Let's move on now to another question, and this one is from Jeremy, which is: how can the heritage sector better address delivering net zero in regard to the reuse of empty buildings? So I think, Liz, you picked up on this issue in your introduction, as did David. So if it's okay, I'll start off by handing it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think we've got a lot of work to do, like an enormous amount of work. You know, you could start right from the beginning, which is the most sustainable building is one that's already built. And can we stop proposing that we build lots of new things when we've got some lovely old things that we could retrofit and really bring back to life in a really kind of suitable way that would protect the heritage, but also provide those kind of really enriched communities that we know people love to live in. So let's take that as read. Going on from that, we've got so much to do around the skills that we have in our sector. So people are looking at the right thing. So they're actually planning what right interventions these building need. So how can we reuse a building? Well, you don't know what you don't know, and there's a massive gap in knowledge there across the sector. And then there is a gap in knowledge in the tradespeople that we might bring in to do this work. And one of the things that I am doing is I'm chairing a green skills task force, which is focusing on what I call the non-sexy skills of heritage. So none of your lime, mortar and thatch here. It's all about plumbing and electricians, but absolutely vital that when these people come in to work in heritage buildings, when they're retrofitting them, when they're putting in heat pumps or solar panels, or just thinking about ventilation, that these people understand how heritage buildings work, how a whole building operates, how one intervention might affect another. And it's our role as a heritage sector to think about upskilling those people and supporting them. And so all the way through from what do you do, who's going to do it, and have we even thought of it in the first place? We've got a massive loop. And I feel like we're kind of 25 years behind where we kind of should be, really. And it feels like a rocket's really gone under this conversation, which is really exciting for those of us who are kind of operating in the space, which we all are. One really important thing is to kind of support those people in heritage making the decisions. And I'm going to give Historic England a plug here, that their new kind of advice for people working in local authorities, timely, comes out tomorrow. And we've all been involved in the consultation process for that, and actually giving that practical advice to local authorities, but also to our caseworkers, so that we can kind of start to join up that thinking. So there's some real practical pieces of work that need to happen. And then at some point, it's going to need a massive deluge of money into these buildings to actually make these changes happen.
Brilliant, Liz. Thank you so much, particularly for the plug for the Historic England advice note. Out tomorrow, everybody.
You can pay me later.
Let's go next to Catherine and then on to Matthew. Catherine, over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm very aware that a lot of the buildings that we care about are some of the hardest to retrofit. There's particularly the buildings of the 60s and 70s, which were built at a period when we thought that we were going to have practically free electrical power forever with no impact on the environment, and was just a totally different world and a totally different mindset. And a lot of those buildings are incredibly lightweight. I think a lot of the advice that's been put out so far about retrofitting historic buildings assumes that they're traditionally built, and that that they are have a huge amount of mass, and the hardest thing for us is people dealing with cold bridging, with curtain walls, with a whole raft of mid and later 20th century building technology, and that we really need to make sure that all that advice remembers that not all historic buildings are the same, and that we probably do need to be investing in actually putting some money into financing some really good case studies for a metal pagoda roofed church in a suburb. How do you make that work and make that cozy so you can actually be using that all day long without running up huge electricity bills? Those sorts of cases we need to be looking at, as well as the more straightforward, perhaps, ways of dealing with earlier buildings.
Great, thanks, Catherine. And some good challenge there. Not that it needs saying, but not all historic buildings are the same, remember. Let's go to Matthew and then to David. Matthew, over to you.
Well, it's certainly the case that the public and government even want simple solutions, easy things that can be done quickly that will fix problems. And in some cases, I think we can offer those. You know, secondary glazing is a no-brainer in most cases for me, and I'd be quite happy to see guidance supporting its use without the need for listed building consent in many cases. But there is a big gap in knowledge and understanding. You know, we really do not know how traditional buildings will perform in the long term with extra insulation and less ventilation introduced. And so I really think the need here is to press government to do the research necessary to understand before, you know, people are encouraged in one direction or funds are thrown in, which could be wasted or, you know, harmful even in some cases.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Importance of research, knowledge and understanding. David, over to you.
Well, really, just to endorse what Catherine and Matthew have said, we do need to somehow collectively reach agreement on retrofitting. It's a very easy word to say, but the solutions to doing that in a way that achieve its goals but protect fabric is very complicated, and it's a fast-moving thing. And I think that's why the Amenity Societies haven't rushed into revising their guidance necessarily on it. Partly we've been waiting for Historic England's piece to come out, which is excellent that it's coming out tomorrow. But it does need to be recognised, as I think Catherine alluded to, that traditional buildings are completely different to modern buildings in that the former is permeable and the latter is not. And I think that's not well understood by the general public, or indeed quite a lot of the people working in the sector. So, like Matthew, I think it would be good if the government could do some research, and maybe that this is another task for Historic England. Some years ago, HE had a house in New Bolsover, I think in Derbyshire, where a lot of work was done on insulation, and that was really when the realization is that, you know, you could cause interstitial condensation by insulating walls in the wrong way. So I think it would be great to have maybe a number of experimental houses in which different solutions could be trialed. But we do need to get away from this rush, which certainly the previous government was guilty of latching on to technological solutions like heat pumps without helping people better understand how buildings work. But one thing we might do to address Liz's point about valuing existing fabric is to introduce, as is the law in Germany, I believe, a presumption against demolition. So a developer or you know, somebody wanting to demolish a building has first to justify that on a number of counts, which would be a very good starting point.
Great, thanks very much, David. There's lots of really interesting questions coming in on the Q&A, and just looking at the time, I'm really conscious that we won't get round to all of them. But I think, Neil, there's an offer that we will write out to people with answers if they don't get a chance to have their question answered in the discussion now. Is that right?
Yeah, we'll take any unanswered questions away, and we'll put them to our hive brain, hive mind, to try and write some answers, and then we'll post them on our website. Okay. At which point I think Claudia seems to have become frozen.
Oh, yes.
In which case, whilst she comes back, I could probably try and pick a question for us all to see. Oh, this is a rare moment for me. Right, which one am I going to go for? Okay, I know one that I will do because I think it is a really good one. Okay, so this is from John, and his question is: where a planning proposal overlaps the interests of several national amenity societies, how are responses coordinated? Matthew, would you have like to have a go at doing that one first, please?
Well, it's relatively easy for us in that we conform to the you know, mutually agreed date convention where our cutoff is 1720, and then we're delighted for the Georgian group to pick up from there. It's a little bit more complicated for others, but that certainly works for us, and it allows us to specialize in things that have always been of particular interest.
Right, apologies. I'm rejoining the chat. In the setup, we had an interesting conversation about Wi-Fi reliability for all the people who are joining this discussion from a hotel room, which I'm not. So I didn't think for a minute that it would be my Wi-Fi that cut out. So apologies, everybody. But let's pick up. And there was one question in the chat. Oh, unless we're in the middle of a question which I've missed.
We were just asking about what happens where the interests of several amenity societies overlap. So Matthew points out that he has a very specific date range. I wondered if we could I was just going to go to Liz next to actually ask, because since she doesn't.
Yes, so we always overlap. We are the overlapping society. We tend to, where there's a building that has many different ages, we might be involved there, but we also do look for the ones that maybe aren't quite as special. So maybe they're not going to be responded to by the other societies, and we will often pick those up. For example, we don't tend to do very much work in London, so we don't tend to respond to very many cases in London at all. We've just had some great analysis done on our casework, and it turns out we're mostly talking to local authorities in the west of the country and in Wales much more than we do in other areas, which is really interesting to see, and we were pleased to see that as well. So we're always overlapping. My caseworker Russ, which I hope is not watching to hear me say this, will say sometimes he picks up things that are lonely and he will respond to those. And then sometimes, and these may be the most fun times, is when something's terrible and we all engage in a nice big massive pile on, because sometimes there is strength in all coming out and all saying this is a terrible plan. So Liverpool Street, which the Victorians coordinated, would be a really good example where majority of the societies actually got stuck into that campaign because we all thought it was such a horrendous proposal that it was worthy of us all having a pile on, which can be very effective.
Brilliant, thanks. I was just going to plug our casework database, which is publicly accessible. And when you go on it, you can see which amenity society has responded to which case. And you will actually see that we don't all respond to the same ones. So actually either our date interests or our special interests actually do mean we are quite focused. So for the CBA, we are very interested in the evidential value of buildings, or, archaeologically, what does a place have to tell us? So we would go to those more quirky, sort of individualistic sites or industrial sites. We're also really interested in those that have communal values, so actually where we can really work with communities to actually unlock the significance of those places. And I think it works really well when you look at the database, because we can see what everyone else is writing as well. So again, that we actually do subconsciously join up on what our issues are. And I think Liz is absolutely right. We will all comment on those really important cases. And that's because they all overlap with all of our interests.
Thanks, Neil. And Deborah, would you like to come in on this one?
Thank you. Just to add very quickly, I think obviously Gardens Trust, our remit first and foremost is outside. It's what's going on outside the building. But we are always conscious of obviously the setting, and we always also need to assure ourselves, particularly when we're being notified on LBCs, sometimes correctly, sometimes maybe not so, that we are able to go in through the database and actually check them, because sometimes even the LBC is going to have an effect. And we also need to make sure that there is the linked planning application. And I think there are still a few tweaks in the database that's been brought to my attention by the conservation team when perhaps we're being consulted. Sorry, this is slightly technical, going off board, but it's about the nature of the consultations and when they are absolutely appropriate, and other times when we have to spend the time just to double check. But obviously the Gardens Trust, first and foremost, it's about the landscape beyond and the impact upon that landscape from any works that may be taking place to the building or built proposals within the landscape.
Thanks, Deborah. I had hoped that we'd get to a really interesting question in the Q&A about intangible heritage, but I think we're going to run out of time for that one. Because I wanted, as we get towards the end, to just ask for a little bit of reflection from today's panel, and invite you to share with the audience just one thing that you'll take away from what has been a really wide-ranging and interesting debate. We've talked about planning reform, we've talked about funding challenges, we've talked about the changing demographic of volunteers, we've talked about research, we've talked about where you want to work together and where you want to work apart. This is example of well, I won't use the word pylon, but what it looks like when collective action and individual action. So it's been fascinating. What's the one thing that you've taken away? And also, there was a little bit of this in the intro, but what would you like to invite the audience to think about if they wanted to get more involved in the work that you do? So perhaps we could start with Matthew, if that's okay. I'll come to you first, and then I'll go on to Liz.
Thanks, Claudia. Well, I think we talk very regularly and actively as societies among ourselves through the joint committee and out of meetings. But actually, it's this evening that I'm going to take away. I think it's been fantastic to entertain such a range of questions, and I'd love to have other opportunities to do it. So I think maybe we can make it a regular occurrence if people are interested to do that. From our point of view, if anyone there is interested in the SPAB and new to us, do come and join one of our working parties. This is something we feel really rewarding. It's a bit like a festival of conservation, if you like. You come along, stay on site sometimes, get your hands dirty, but it's a great way to really immerse yourself in historic buildings work and discover what it's all about.
So I think it's been whenever I'm with this group of people, I'm amazed by how clever they are, how much they know, and that I never get to spend enough time with them. So I think I am going to take away that we do need to do this more often. We do need to talk to each other, and how lucky and supported I feel to work within this group. I would put a plug to follow us on social media, and I think that might go for all the societies actually. We're really active. If you want to get a flavour of not only the work that we're doing, but like literally how our days are going, follow us all on social media, and that was a really good way of keeping in touch with us all.
Brilliant, really good idea. Thank you, Liz. Let's go next to Neil. Neil, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm just delighted everyone could join us. So my takeaway is the need for us to carry on talking, but also the fact that we need to do things differently. And so for me, the really big thing we need to do is understand how we build aspiration into our pitch. How do we become more aspirational for society out there? What does that mean in terms of national amenity? Yeah, because we are the National Amenity Societies. Well, I don't know if anyone actually really knows what national amenity means. So maybe we might need to be more aspirational in our name about what it is we actually do. And I'm going to be cheeky because that does link back to that intangible heritage question. Because for me, all heritage is intangible. Okay, unless we work with people's thought processes, minds and beliefs about stuff, none of it matters. So actually, we really need to understand that it's the people we need to be talking to and carrying with us. Yeah, and how does that mean? What's that relationship between our knowledge, our expertise, their aspirations, their goals, their lives? So again, this has to be the start of that reimagining conversation that was in the title of this evening.
Thank you, Neil. And same question to you, Catherine, if that's okay. Take away from this evening.
Sure. Well, I think I would definitely agree with all that. And perhaps to Neil's aspiration, I would add making sure that we find the joy that we all share in these buildings and share that around as big an audience as possible. I think I'd like to take away that I think I think we should be better at putting it out there what amazing value we are. We get very, very tiny amounts of government funding, the National Amenity Society, and we are pulling in, you've seen from everybody, an enormous amount of expertise and activities from not just from our staff, but from our committee members and our regular members and our huge bands of volunteers. And I think we need to be, put that out there more, maybe. And then in terms of getting involved, we've talked a lot today about the statutory process and the referral system, which is the thing that links us all together, and the database that allows us to actually deliver that. But for a 20th Century Society, as I said at the beginning, I think a lot of the buildings that we get involved with are just too young to be listed when the threat first arises. And the only way we get to know about them, and the only way that we are able to get involved, is if somebody, one of our members or a supporter or somebody out there says, there's this great building, it's not that old, and we think it might be quite good, actually tells us about it as early as possible, at the point perhaps when it shuts down, before the bulldozers are right outside, and then we can work with communities to look at those buildings. So let us know, send us a photo.
Fantastic, thanks, Catherine. And let's go next to David with the same questions, if that's okay. Takeaway from this evening, and what should people do if they want to know more or get involved?
Well, for fear of being repetitious, I'm with Matthew very much, that I found this evening's discussion revelatory in a way. We meet periodically. There are essentially two parts of our meeting structure. One where we meet together to talk about issues confidentially, about public consultation, etc., etc. And the second where we invite guests to make presentations, which is very interesting and by way of continuing professional development, I suppose. But we've recently introduced a third section, a pre-meeting, in which we share information about running small charities, as we all do. So there's a sort of support system, the solidarity in that regard. But this evening we've had an extra honorary member, if you like, of the joint committee, which is the collective brain of all the people online asking questions. And I think that's been a really interesting and useful prompt, not least to do what I think Neil is encouraging us to do, which is to do some serious future gazing, and maybe to try to tackle some of the issues that we've discussed this evening in a collective way. So that's my takeaway. I think it's been very interesting and informative.
Thank you, David. And finally, over to you, Deborah, for final thoughts.
Thank you. I think, again, very much want to endorse what everyone else has said. It is about communication. It is about actually, it is about crowing from the roof a bit. I think we are all achieving extraordinary things with increasingly limited resources. I know that the Gardens Trust annual report is very well received. We had to do an awful lot of work for the rapid review very early on this year. And again, I think that sent a very clear message that we're delivering way over and above what I think a lot of people thought that we did. And through our events, and through particularly through events such as Historic Landscape Assemblies, which are coming up again now in the autumn, it's really helping to share our passion and our expertise beyond our core audience, that it is relevant, that landscape, particularly for us, is relevant for everyone, and it's all part of the wider mix of national amenity. In terms of moving forward, obviously, I would encourage everybody to look at the website, for people to join either as members of the Garden Trust or their County Gardens Trust, or both. You can be a member of both, of course, and really to find opportunities, because there are so, as I said earlier on, there are so many ways of getting into landscape. The history is incredibly important, but there are so many other ways in, and the more diversity, or the more breadth we have in that form of engagement, again, the richer, the more informed we will be able to be in order to respond to the pressures that are upon us. And that could be something as simple as contributing to Historic England's Refreshing the List programme, or actually really beginning to explore landscapes in a completely different way in terms of things like green infrastructure, public green spaces, food production, whatever. It is all out there. It is all up for grabs.
Thank you, Deborah. So I think at this point, just before I hand over to Neil to close, I just wanted to say thank you to all of the panel, but also thank you to everybody for the really challenging and expert and informed questions that have been coming in, and for the really interesting and engaging chat. I think it's felt very much like a conversation, and that has really added to making this such a kind of thought-provoking and rich discussion. I feel like we've scratched the surface of some big issues. We've set out some huge challenges. Liz, 25 years behind is one of my takeaways, but we've also ended on a really inspirational note, I think, which is about all the great things that are happening and all of the great work that is being done, and the need to shout louder about some of that great work. So I'll stop here, and I will hand back to you, Neil, to close.
You're muted, Neil.
Yeah, it's because I've got my notes to read, and two things at once is always a bad move for me. So, sorry. Thank you, Claudia. I'm going to ask Liz to do a formal thanks for you at the very end, but I've just got to do some more little bits of housekeeping. So in the chat, we're going to launch a little poll now for you all, just to see how we did this evening and whether you've enjoyed yourselves and whether you've learned something. So if you could have a quick go at the poll. There'll also be a link in the chat, and we'll send out to everyone who attended the lecture our formal feedback survey, because this is part of the CBA's Festival of Archaeology. So again, we're really keen for you to let us know how we got on, what else you'd like to do, how the booking system went, and everything. I'm delighted that we managed to pull this off and that we've done it. And I think I'm just so pleased with what David said about how do we make this more of an ongoing conversation. And I think that's certainly, you know, what Liz and I had hoped to do when we first suggested this crazy idea. So the Festival of Archaeology continues for another 7 days, everybody. So please, if you're interested in archaeology, and I know all my panel members love a bit of archaeology, please do get onto the CBA's festival website and go and see what activities are available still to do. Just to let you know that tomorrow night we have another of our This is Archaeology lectures. That's Roots in Time, who were the winners of the Outstanding Archaeological Achievement Award from last year. So that's exploring how archaeology and tree planting go hand to hand in Worcestershire. I'm off down a Roman gold mine tomorrow, so watch me on social media. I want to see how that goes. And then tomorrow is, I think it's tomorrow, yes, tomorrow is our Youth Day. So we have the Early Careers Conference from the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists. So again, online, please go onto the website. You'll find all of those activities. And if that's not enough, Thursday of this week is a day in archaeology, where you can go online and see blog posts, and now for the first time, video blogs about what it's like to be an archaeologist. So to help you all get enthused about what we do. And then finally, if you want a little bit of a building in our Festival of Archaeology, our closing event is on Sunday, the 28th of July at the fabulous and fantastic Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. So please do come along and join us and the National Trust there. So I'm going to ask Liz if she'd just do a final thank you. To everyone else, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful evening, and I've really enjoyed spending time with you all. Liz.
Thank you, Neil. So I will do the formal thank yous. Claudia, we'd have been hopeless without you. The evidence when your Wi-Fi ducked out and we went all over the place for 2 minutes is proof of that. Thank you so much. We will book you again, because I think we should come back and do this another time. Thank you so much for that. To all of you asking questions, they've been really brilliant. We didn't have to use our emergency questions at all, so thank you so much for that, because they were hopeless compared to yours. And to all my fellow directors, thank you for being here. Thank you for representing your organisation. You are on this webinar probably because you're already a member of one of these organisations, but we are all membership organisations. So if you are able, why not join a second and have a second chance to get amazing publications, fantastic events, and support an organisation doing amazing work in this space. So please, if you are able, that is the best way to support us, is to become a member. So thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of the evening, and we will definitely do this again. Thank you, Neil, for hosting us, and to all of your team. Have a lovely festival. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.